The city stretched out below the penthouse like a living map of glittering lights in endless movement. But inside, everything was cool, quiet, and perfect. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and money. This was the world of the millionaire, a man named Leo Vance. He'd built his fortune not from old family wealth, but from a single brilliant idea for a phone app that the whole world seemed to download. Now, in his early 40s, he lived in a sleek, modern space of glass, steel, and spotless surfaces. He was used to things working with a click, a command, or a swipe. He was charming, sure, but it was the sharp, quick charm of someone who always won an argument. Tonight, the penthouse was full of that particular hum of success. A few fellow investors and tech founders lounged on the low white sofas, holding glasses of something expensive. The talk was of market shares and mergers, of risks that had paid off and bigger risks on the horizon. Laughter came in easy bursts. A sound of confidence moving through this scene, almost invisible, was the housekeeper. Her name was Elena. She was a woman in her late 20s, with a quiet face that gave little away. She wore a simple gray dress, practical and clean. She'd only been working for Mr. Vance for a few weeks, hired through a top agency. Her references simply said she was thorough, discreet, and reliable. That was all he needed to know. To the men in the room, she was part of the background, like the beautiful abstract painting on the wall or the silent waterfall feature. She replenished a bowl of olives, her movements smooth and efficient. She collected an empty glass from a coaster without a sound. Her eyes were usually down, watching for smudges on the chrome or crumbs on the rug. Leo watched her for a moment from his spot by the floor-to-ceiling window. He felt good. The night was going well. The view was magnificent, and he was surrounded by people who spoke his language of ambition and victory. His gaze drifted across the room and landed on the grand piano. It was a beautiful jet-black instrument, positioned to catch the light just right. He'd bought it at an auction because it looked impressive, because it filled a corner of the vast living area with a sense of cultured grandeur. He didn't play a note. He wasn't even sure if it was properly in tune. It was, for him, a sculpture. An idea popped into his head. Not a mean idea, exactly, but a playful, mischievous one. The kind of idea that comes from feeling completely at ease and in charge of your surroundings. He saw a chance to add a little fun to the conversation, to share a joke with his friends at nobody's real expense. He clinked his finger against his glass softly, getting everyone's attention. The murmur of voices died down. "You know," Leo began, a smile playing on his lips. "I've been meaning to have this thing tuned for months." He gestured with his chin towards the piano. "It probably sounds like a cat walking across the keys." A few polite chuckles rippled through the group. They followed his gaze. "Elena," Leo called out, his voice warm but carrying. She stopped near the entrance to the kitchen, a tray in her hands. She looked up, her expression neutral, waiting. "Come over here for a second, will you?" he said. She placed the tray silently on a side table and walked over, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. The eyes of the room were on her now. She didn't fidget, but a careful person might have noticed the slightest tightening in her shoulders. "What can I do for you, Mr. Vance?" Her voice was soft, with a gentle accent that hinted at Eastern Europe. Leo's smile widened. He was setting up the punchline. "Well, I need a second opinion. My ear for music is terrible. I want you to do me a favor. Go on, play a few notes on this beast. Just hit some keys. Let these gentlemen hear how awful it sounds, so I finally have to call the tuner tomorrow." He gave his guests a wink. It was a game. They understood the game. The request was for the housekeeper, the quiet woman who cleaned, to perform a silly, simple task. It would be funny to see her awkwardly tap a key. It would be a moment of shared humor. One of the men, a guy with a neat beard, grinned and took a sip of his drink. ready for the show. Elena's face didn't change, but for the first time, her eyes showed something. A flicker of alarm. Then something deeper, a shadow that looked almost like pain. She looked at the piano, then quickly back at the floor. "Oh, no, Mr. Vance. I couldn't," she said, her voice even quieter. "I am sure it is a very fine instrument." "Nonsense," Leo said, his tone still light. He was enjoying this. Her reluctance made it better. "It's just a bit of fun. Consider it a team exercise. Help your boss out." The others joined in, not unkindly, but with the easy pressure of a crowd. "Go on, give it a try," one said. "We promise not to laugh too much." Another added with a chuckle. Elena stood perfectly still in the middle of the luxurious room. She was caught. Saying no again would seem rude, would spoil the mood of the party her boss was hosting. Saying yes felt like a kind of small humiliation. She could feel the weight of their expectation, their amusement. Leo watched her, his head slightly tilted, confident she would comply with this small, whimsical demand, finally, with a slow breath that seemed to come from the very bottom of her lungs. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. She didn't look at Leo or the guests. Her eyes were locked on the piano, as if it were a distant shore. The room grew quieter, the playful tension thickening. This was the moment. She would walk over, poke a key with one finger. They would all laugh good-naturedly, and the conversation would move on. But Elena didn't walk like someone heading toward a joke. She moved as if in a trance. Each step was deliberate. When she reached the polished bench, she didn't just sit. She paused, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of the glossy black wood. It was a touch so tender, it looked like a greeting dot, and she sat. And the moment she did, something in her posture shifted. The slight hunch she carried from a long day of work melted away. Her spine straightened, her shoulders dropped and squared. She lifted her chin. The woman who was Elena, the housekeeper, seemed to recede, and someone else sat at the piano. Someone with a quiet, unshakable authority. She didn't look at the guests. She didn't smile or make a nervous joke. She simply lifted the fallboard, revealing the row of white and black keys. She stretched her hands out in front of her, flexing the fingers slightly. They were capable hands with short, clean nails. Hands used to work. Leo's smile had faded. He was no longer leaning back casually. He was watching, puzzled. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected. This was strange. The man with the neat beard stopped smiling, his glass halfway to his lips. Elena placed her hands on the keys. For a second, there was absolute silence in the penthouse, broken only by the faint whisper of the city far below. Then she began to play. The silence that followed her first chord wasn't empty. It was stunned. It was a silence that sucked the air out of the room. The deep, resonant note hadn't been a timid tap. It was a single, profound sound that seemed to vibrate in the bones of everyone listening. It hung in the air, rich and full, completely destroying Leo's joke about the piano being out of tune in an instant. Before anyone could even process that first sound, her other hand joined. It wasn't a melody you could hum along to, not at first. It was a series of chords, deep and questioning, rolling like distant thunder. They were powerful, complex, and they built a feeling of deep longing right there in the sleek, modern room. The polite smiles on the investors' faces froze and melted away completely. The man with the neat beard slowly lowered his glass to the table, the quiet clink sounding like a gunshot in the new quiet. Leo felt his own breath catch in his throat. He was a man who understood code, patterns, logic. What he was hearing was pure, raw emotion, and it was coming from his housekeeper's hands. He stood rooted to the spot, his mind scrambling. This was impossible. This was a mistake. But the music wouldn't stop. Then, the storm began to take shape. The deep, rumbling chords gave way to a flurry of notes from her right hand, a waterfall of sound, delicate and impossibly fast, dancing over the darker tones from her left. The piece had a name, a history, a soul, though none of the men in the room knew it. It was Chopin's Ballade No. 1. It was a story of a lost homeland, of heartbreak, of a fierce, beautiful anger. And Elena was telling that story with her whole being. Her face had changed. The careful, neutral mask was gone. Her eyes were fixed on a point somewhere beyond the piano, seeing nothing in the room. Her brow was slightly furrowed in concentration, but there was also a deep sadness in the set of her mouth. She wasn't just playing notes. She was living inside them. Her body moved with the music, not with big, showy gestures, but with a natural flow. She leaned into the passionate sections, her shoulders curving over the keys. During the softer, heartbreaking passages, she seemed to draw inward, her movements becoming smaller, more precise. One of the guests, an older man who had made his fortune in silent, ruthless deals, found his eyes unexpectedly stinging. He looked away, embarrassed, blinking rapidly at the city lights. The music had reached in and touched a memory he hadn't visited in decades. A simpler time, a different dream. He didn't understand how a simple piano tune could do that. Leo's mind was a whirlwind. The joke was gone, utterly obliterated. In its place was a swelling sense of shock, and underneath that, a hot, prickling shame. He had asked her to perform a silly trick. He had put her on the spot for a laugh, and she had responded by opening a door to a part of herself he never knew existed, a part that was monumental and heartbreakingly beautiful. He watched her hands. They flew across the keys with a certainty and grace that spoke of thousands of hours of practice. These were the same hands that scrubbed his sink and polished his windows. The disconnect was dizzying. The music swelled, building to a furious, cascading climax. The sound filled the penthouse, not as noise, but as a physical presence. It pushed against the glass walls. It vibrated in the metal beams. For a minute, the entire glittering city outside seemed to fade to a dull blur, unimportant. The only real thing in the universe was the woman at the piano and the storm she was conjuring. And then, as suddenly as the storm had risen, it broke. The music fractured into a series of aching, single notes, like tears falling. The final notes were so soft, they were almost just a breath against the strings. They lingered, a ghost of the passion that had just filled the room. Alina's hands went still. She let them rest gently on the keys for a long moment, her head bowed. The silence returned, but it was a completely different kind of silence than before. It was thick, heavy, sacred almost. No one moved. No one knew what to do. The expected applause after a performance felt wrong, too cheap for what they had just witnessed. Clapping would be like applauding a sunrise. Slowly, Elena lifted her hands from the piano. The movement seemed to take great effort, as if she was pulling herself back from a faraway place. She gently closed the fallboard over the keys. The soft click was the loudest sound in the room. She stood up from the bench. The transformation reversed itself. Her shoulders softened, losing their proud posture. Her eyes, which had been blazing with an inner fire, dimmed and lowered to the floor. The artist was gone, folded back inside the shell of the housekeeper. She turned to face the room, down her gaze swept over the stunned faces of the guests, seeing their open mouths and wide eyes, and finally landed on Leo. His face was pale. His usual confident expression wiped clean, replaced by something like awe and confusion. For a second, their eyes held. In her look, he saw no triumph, no, "I told you so." He saw only a deep exhaustion, and a flicker of something that looked like vulnerability. as if she had just been caught naked in the middle of the room. Then she broke the gaze. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not to anyone in particular, and without a single word, she turned and walked back toward the kitchen. Her footsteps were silent on the rug. She picked up the tray she had left on the side table, her movements automatic again, and disappeared through the doorway. The spell was broken, but the room remained frozen. The older investor cleared his throat, a rough, awkward sound. He picked up his drink, but didn't sip it. He just stared into the amber liquid. "Well," said the man with the neat beard, his voice strangely hushed. "I wasn't expecting that." It was the understatement of the century. The others murmured in agreement, shifting in their seats, trying to find their way back to the easy conversation of before. But it was impossible. The ghost of the music was still there, haunting the air. Their talk of stocks and startups now felt shallow. Tinny Dot Leo finally managed to move. He walked slowly to the piano, as if drawn by a magnet. He ran his fingers over the sleek, black lid, still warm from the light above. He looked at the empty bench. Just minutes ago, this had been a prop in his little game. Now it felt like an altar. He had lived in this apartment for 3 years, but he felt, for the first time, like he was a stranger in it. He had shared this space with a woman every day for weeks, and he realized he knew nothing about her at all. Nothing real. He had wanted a few clumsy notes for a laugh. Instead, he had been given a glimpse of a soul, and in doing so, he had made himself the fool. The party ended soon after, the goodbyes quiet and hurried. Leo barely registered them. He stood by the piano long after the elevator had taken the last guest down, listening to the new, profound silence of his home, and wondering who, exactly, was living under his roof. The rest of the night passed in a strange, thick haze for the millionaire. After the last guest had mumbled their awkward goodbyes, the silence in the penthouse didn't feel empty anymore. It felt loaded. It hummed with the memory of the music. He walked from room to room, the usual satisfaction he felt in his beautiful home completely gone. Everything looked the same, the clean lines, the expensive art, the perfect view, but it all felt like a stage set, fake and flimsy. His mind kept replaying the scene. The stupid, smug smile on his own face as he'd called her over. The way she had looked at the piano, not with fear of embarrassment, but with a kind of painful longing. The shock of that first sound. But most of all, he saw her face when she finished. That look of quiet exposure, and then the swift retreat back into her role. He felt a hot twist of shame in his gut. It wasn't a feeling he was familiar with. He was used to being right, to being in control. He didn't see her again that night. The kitchen was spotless, lights off. She had clearly finished her work and gone to her small private room in the staff quarters, separate from the main living area. The distance between their parts of the penthouse felt like a canyon. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, his dreams were filled with tangled melodies and a piano that played itself. He woke up early, before sunrise, the events of the previous evening sitting on his chest like a weight. Morning routine was usually a comfort. Today, it felt off. He made his own coffee, the machine seeming too loud in the quiet. He sat at the vast breakfast bar, staring out at the city turning from black to gray to gold. He was waiting. He realized he was listening for the soft sound of her footsteps. He heard her before he saw her. The gentle swish of a cleaning cloth on a surface in the living room. He took a deep breath, put his coffee down, and walked in. She was there, dusting the very piano she had played. Her back was to him. She was dressed in her same gray uniform, her movements methodical and careful. She was treating it like any other piece of furniture. The sight made his heart ache in a way he couldn't explain. "Good morning," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. She started slightly, turning around. Her face was that calm mask again, polite and blank. "Good morning, Mr. Vance. Can I get you anything? More coffee?" He shook his head. He just stood there, feeling clumsy and huge in his own living room. The man who could command a room full of investors had no idea what to say to his housekeeper. "About last night," he began, then stopped. What could he say? Sorry, I made you perform like a circus act? Sorry, I discovered you're a genius? She looked at the cloth in her hands, folding it neatly. "It is no matter, sir," she said softly, her accent more noticeable in the morning quiet. "The guests, they enjoyed the party?" Her question was so normal, so focused on her job, that it threw him even more. She was trying to sweep it all under the rug, to go back to how things were. He realized with a jolt that he couldn't. He didn't want to. "No," he said, the word coming out firmly. "I mean, yes, but that's not." He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated with himself. "The music you played, it wasn't nothing." She finally looked up at him, her eyes guarded. There was a wariness there, as if she was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for a criticism about overstepping. He took a step closer, then thought better of it, and leaned against the back of a sofa, trying to seem less intimidating. "Where did you learn to play like that?" It was a simple question, but her whole body seemed to close off. She looked down again. "A long time ago, sir. When I was a girl?" She offered nothing more. "You don't just learn that as a girl," he said, his tone gentle but insistent. "That was professional. World class. I may not know music, but I know excellence when I hear it. I've built a career on recognizing it." A flicker of something crossed her face pain, maybe, or pride, quickly buried. She remained silent, a living wall. His shame was slowly being replaced by a deep, burning curiosity. Who was this woman he had hired to scrub his floors? "Please," he said, and the word sounded foreign coming from him. "Talk to me. Have a cup of coffee with me. Just for a minute." She seemed to weigh the request, the unusual break in protocol. After a long moment, she gave a small, tight nod. They sat at the breakfast bar, a large space between them on the stools. She held her coffee mug with both hands, as if for warmth. For a few minutes, they just sat in the growing morning light. The city was waking up below them, but up here, time felt suspended. "I came to this country 3 years ago," she began, her voice so low he had to strain to hear. She didn't look at him, but at the steam rising from her mug. "I was supposed to come earlier. I had a scholarship for the piano at a conservatory here." Leo felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He said nothing, just listened. It was all arranged. A big chance. My teacher at home, she worked so hard to get it for me. A small, sad smile touched her lips and vanished. Then my mother became very sick. There was no one else. The doctors, the treatments. It took everything. The savings from my travel, even some of the school money. I stayed. I took care of her. The story was told in simple, flat sentences. But Leo could feel the universe of loss in the spaces between them. "When she passed," Elena continued, blinking slowly, "the scholarship was long gone. The spot was filled. The visa I had was for study. With no school, it was nothing. I had to start over. But there were debts. From the illness." She finally took a sip of coffee. "So I came on a different visa. To work. The agency, they said my English was good, and I was careful. They trained me for housekeeping. It is honest work." She said the last part with a quiet dignity that shattered something inside Leo. Honest work. And he had treated it, and her, as something nearly invisible. "And the piano?" he asked quietly. Her shoulders lifted in a tiny, broken shrug. "I do not play anymore." Last night. It was a mistake. I am sorry if it disturbed your evening. You're sorry? The words burst out of him, filled with a disbelief at her apology. Elena, you didn't disturb anything. You woke something up. In me. In that whole room. He stood up, unable to sit still. He paced a few steps, his mind, usually so sharp with business plans, racing in a new direction. He wasn't a music man. He was a fixer, a builder. He saw a spectacular talent, buried under dusting and debt, and his instincts screamed to solve it. He turned to her. You can't stop. You can't just not play. She looked at him then, and for the first time, he saw a flash of the fire from the night before, but it was angry and defensive. And what should I do, Mr. Vance? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Play in subway stations for coins? This job pays my debt. It gives me a room. It is stable. Music does not pay these bills. Not for someone like me. Her words were a bucket of cold water. She was right. The world was full of brilliant people who never got a break. He had just never been this close to one before. He walked back to the counter, leaning on it, looking directly at her. Then we changed the arrangement. She stared at him, confusion replacing the anger. Your job here is safe. Nothing changes about that. But from now on this, he said, pointing toward the living room and the piano, is also part of your job. Consider it an extra duty. I want you to play every day for yourself, for that piano, which has probably never been used for anything real until last night. She opened her mouth to protest, but he held up a hand. I'm not asking you to perform for parties. I'm giving you permission. No, I'm asking you. As your employer, please use that instrument. Let me hear it again. Not as a joke, but as what it is. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the fear of hope, the weariness of dreams that had caused so much pain. She had built a life of simple, clear tasks to survive. He was asking her to open a door she had locked tight. She looked from his earnest face to the distant shape of the piano in the other room. The silence stretched out, filled with the ghosts of old music and the practical weight of the present. Finally, she looked back at her coffee mug and gave the smallest. Barely, their nod. It wasn't a yes of joy. It was a yes of cautious, fragile trust. It was a beginning. The new arrangement felt, at first, like a strange dream. For the next few days, an awkward dance unfolded in the penthouse. The millionaire, Leo, would leave for his office or shut himself in his study for calls. And Elena would go about her normal work, the dusting, the laundry, the meticulous ordering of a world that demanded perfection. But now there was a new item on the mental list. The piano got it first, she avoided it. It felt like a trap, a trick. The memory of that night was still raw, a vulnerable part of herself she had accidentally left exposed. To go and sit there by choice felt dangerous. What if he was listening? What if it had all just been another kind of request, a demand for a private performance? But a week after their talk, on a quiet Thursday afternoon, with the sun streaming in, she found herself standing before the instrument again. Her hands were not holding a duster this time. They were empty. She just stood there, looking at the dark, glossy wood. It had been years since she had played for herself, without pressure, without an audience expecting something. The music she had known was tied up with so much loss, the loss of her teacher's proud smile, the loss of the concert hall that was supposed to be her future, the silent apartment after her mother was gone. Playing had become an act of mourning. Then it became too painful, and she stopped altogether. She reached out and lifted the fallboard. The white and black keys stared back, waiting. She sat, the familiar feel of the bench beneath her both comforting and alien. She placed her fingers on the keys, but didn't press down. She just let them rest there, feeling the cool, smooth ivory. Then, very softly, she began. Not with the storm and fury of Chopin, but with a simple, slow scale. The notes were clear and true. She played another. Then a gentle exercise, the kind she had practiced as a small child. It was boring, basic, but it was a start. The sound was small in the big room, but it was hers. Unbeknownst to her, Leo was in his study. The door was cracked open. At the first few tentative notes, he stopped typing. He sat back in his chair, listening. It wasn't the breathtaking music of the party. This was different. This sounded fragile, like someone testing the temperature of water, or walking on a leg that had fallen asleep. He didn't move. He just listened, a strange feeling in his chest, part protectiveness, part awe at her simple courage to begin again. That became the pattern. Little by little, Elena reclaimed the instrument. She would play for 15 minutes, then 30. Sometimes it was technical work. Sometimes she would venture into a small piece, a melody by Schumann or a prelude by Bach. The music was often sad, reflective, but beautiful in its honesty. Leo never interrupted. He never walked in and made a comment. But he was always aware. He found himself structuring his day around these pockets of sound. If he had a call, he would take it in a different room. He started leaving a small bottle of water on the side table near the piano in the mornings. He didn't say why. She never mentioned it. But the bottle would be empty by the afternoon. One evening, he came out of his study to find her playing something livelier, a lively rhythmic piece by a Spanish composer. Her head was moving slightly with the beat, a faint unconscious smile on her lips as she navigated a tricky passage. She was so absorbed she didn't hear him. He watched from the hallway, a real smile spreading on his own face. It was the first time he had seen her look anything close to happy. He retreated quietly, not wanting to break the spell. The wall between employer and employee didn't come crashing down. It just developed a door in it. They didn't become friends, not exactly. But they began to talk, in bits and pieces. He asked a careful question over coffee one morning. "That piece yesterday, with the fast part in the middle, what's that called?" She looked surprised, then pleased. She told him. She even hummed a little of the theme. He nodded, remembering the sound. Another time, she was polishing a large photograph in his study, an award he'd won years ago. She paused. "This was for your application? The one that started everything?" He was surprised she knew. "Yes, a lot of late nights." "A lot of doubt." She nodded, her cloth circling the frame. "I understand late nights. And doubt." She didn't elaborate, but the shared understanding hung in the air. He started to see her not as the help, but as a person with a profound skill and a history of resilience. He saw the careful way she budgeted her grocery list, the worn but spotless shoes she wore on her day off. His initial shame transformed into a deep, determined respect. He wanted to help, but he knew that throwing money at the problem would be another kind of insult. It had to be smarter than that. The idea came to him slowly. He was a man of networks, of connections. He knew people who knew people in every field, including the arts. One day, after hearing her play a particularly moving piece that had left a quiet ache in the apartment, he made a decision. He called an old university friend who now sat on the board of a prestigious music school. He didn't tell Elena's story, not yet. He just asked hypothetical questions. If there was someone undiscovered with remarkable talent but no formal credentials here, what would be the path? The conversation led to another, and another. He learned about audition tapes, about benefactors, about quiet introductions that could bypass rigid systems. He learned that the world of classical music, for all its beauty, could be as hard and closed off as the tech world. One Saturday afternoon, he found her in the living room. Not playing, but just sitting on the sofa, looking tired. The week had been long. "Can I ask you something?" he said, sitting in a chair opposite her. She nodded. "If you could play for someone, not a party, but someone who really knows music, who could?" "I don't know." "Understand what they're hearing? Would you want to?" Her guard went up instantly. "Mr. Vance, I am not a performer anymore. What happened that night it wasn't a mistake," he finished for her, his voice firm but kind. "It was a revelation. And I'm not talking about performing. I'm talking about an assessment. A conversation between you and another musician. No pressure. Just sound." She studied his face, looking for the joke, the ulterior motive. She saw only a sincere, focused intensity. "Who?" she asked simply. "A friend of a friend. A retired professor from the conservatory. A very good man. He just loves music. He comes, has tea, listens if you feel like playing. That's all. No promises. No expectations." The word conservatory made her flinch. It was the ghost of her old dream. She looked down at her hands, resting in her lap. They were capable hands, but they felt like they belonged to someone else sometimes. The thought of playing for a professor was terrifying. It was stepping back into a world that had rejected her, but she also remembered the feeling of the music, filling her up these past weeks. The simple joy of solving a difficult passage. The water bottle left by the piano. "When?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Whenever you say. Or never. It's entirely up to you." She was silent for a long time. The city hummed outside. She thought of her mother, who had saved every coin for her early lessons. She thought of the debt that still felt like a chain. She thought of the quiet, safe life she had built, and the strange, insistent kindness of this man who was her boss. She took a deep, shaky breath. "Okay," she said. "Okay, I will try." It wasn't a triumphant yes. It was a scared, brave whisper. But it was enough. Leo simply nodded, not smiling broadly, but with a look of deep respect. "Good," he said. "I'll make the arrangements. You decide the day, the time, what you play. This is yours." He got up and left her sitting there, surrounded by the silent, beautiful room. She looked over at the piano, no longer a piece of furniture or a symbol of a painful joke, but now a doorway. A terrifying, possible doorway. For the first time in years, the future did not feel like a straight, narrow line of duty. It felt unknown and fragile and terrifyingly alive. The day the professor was to come, the air in the penthouse felt different. It wasn't the quiet of an empty space, but the heavy, waiting quiet before a storm. Elena moved through her morning tasks like a ghost. She cleaned surfaces that were already clean. She rearranged flowers that were already perfect. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as she folded a linen napkin. Leo noticed. He worked from home that day, but he stayed in his study, giving her space. He felt a nervous energy himself, a feeling he usually got before a big product launch. But this wasn't his. This was hers. He had set something in motion, and now he had to step back and hope it worked. The professor arrived in the afternoon. He was an older man with kind eyes and a gentle handshake. He didn't look like a gatekeeper to a famous world. He looked like a gentle grandfather. He spoke softly to Leo, and then turned to Elena, who stood stiffly near the kitchen doorway. "It is a pleasure to meet you," the professor said, his voice warm. "Please do not be nervous. For me, this is a treat. To hear music in a home, not a hall. There are no judges here today. just ears that loved to listen. His words helped, but only a little. Elena nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Tea was made, small talk was exchanged about the view. But everyone knew why they were there. After about 20 minutes, the professor put his cup down. He looked at the piano, then at Elena. "Whenever you are ready," he said. "Or not at all. We can just talk about music instead." She knew she would lose her courage if she waited. She stood up, smoothed her simple dress, not her uniform, but a plain blue dress she owned, and walked to the piano. She didn't look at the two men. She sat, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands in her lap for a moment, collecting herself. She had decided not to play the fiery, difficult piece from the party. That was a performance. Today, she chose something else. A nocturne. A night song. It was melancholic and lyrical, full of longing and a quiet, singing beauty. She began to play. Leo watched the professor's face. At first, it was politely attentive. Then, as the melody unfolded, the old man's expression changed. The polite interest melted away. His eyebrows lifted slightly. He leaned forward in his chair, his head tilting as if to catch every vibration. His eyes closed for a moment, then opened, sharp and focused on her hands. The music was not loud, but it filled every corner of the room with a deep, sorrowful sweetness. Elena was not playing for an audience now. She was inside the music, her body swaying gently, her face relaxed in a way Leo had never seen. All the fear was gone. In its place was a profound connection to the notes she was creating. When the last note faded, the silence was deep and respectful. The professor did not clap. He simply sat there for a long moment, looking at her. Then he took a slow breath. "Your touch," he said, his voice hushed with something like reverence. "Your phrasing, it is not studied. It is felt. Where did you train?" And so the story came out haltingly to this kind stranger. The scholarship, the sick mother, the lost chance. She spoke of her early teacher back home, a formidable woman who had drilled technique into her, but also taught her that music was breath, was life. The professor listened, nodding slowly. When she finished, he was quiet again. "What you have," he said finally, "time and circumstance cannot give. And what you lack, papers, a recent history can be addressed." He turned to Leo. "You were right to call me." He asked Elena if she would play a scale and a specific technical exercise. He asked her about composers. Her answers, tentative at first, grew more confident as they spoke the same language, the language of keys and chords and interpretations. After an hour, the professor stood to leave. He took Elena's hand. "Thank you," he said, and it was clear he meant it deeply. "You have given me a gift this afternoon." He turned to Leo. "I will make some calls. There are people who need to hear this. Not for a big concert, not yet. For an opportunity. A real one." After he left, the penthouse felt charged with possibility. Elena stood in the middle of the living room, looking dazed, as if she had been gently struck by lightning. "It's a start," Leo said gently. "Just a start." What followed were weeks of quiet, secret preparation. The professor was true to his word. He arranged for a small, private audition. Not for a concert hall, but for a place in a prestigious artist-in-residence program. It was designed for gifted musicians who, for whatever reason, had fallen outside the traditional paths. It offered coaching, a small stipend, and most importantly, a legal path to work as a musician. But a spot had to be earned. Elena's life became a delicate balancing act. Her days were still filled with her duties in the penthouse, but her evenings and her days off were consumed by practice. The piano was no longer a place for quiet exploration. It became her workshop. She worked on the required pieces with a fierce, focused intensity that Leo recognized from his own early days building his company. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, but also a new light within them. He helped in the only ways he could. He made sure she never had to worry about meals. He invented errands to give her extra hours of undisturbed time. He became a silent supporter in the wings. The day of the private audition arrived. She was to play for 3 people in a small, elegant room at a music foundation. Leo drove her there in his car. She was silent the whole way, her hands clenched in her lap. "Just play like you do when you think no one is listening," he said as they pulled up. It was the only advice he could give. She nodded, took a deep breath, and got out of the car. He didn't go in. He waited outside, pacing like an expectant father. The hour she was inside felt longer than the entire time she had worked for him. When she emerged, her face was pale, but calm. She got into the car. "Well?" he asked. "I played," she said simply. "I played everything." It was okay. They didn't talk about it much after that. Life in the penthouse returned to its new normal. She cleaned. She practiced. They shared the occasional quiet meal, talking about everything and nothing. The unspoken question hung in the air. The answer came 2 weeks later, in a thick, official-looking envelope addressed to her. Leo brought it to her as she was finishing the breakfast dishes. Her hands were wet and soapy. She dried them slowly, thoroughly, before taking the letter. She opened it with careful fingers. Her eyes scanned the page once, then again. She didn't make a sound. Then a single sharp gasp escaped her lips. Her hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes filled with instant, shining tears. She looked up at Leo, the letter shaking in her hand. "I am in," she whispered. "The program. They accepted me. They want me to start next month." The joy that broke across her face was the most beautiful thing Leo had ever seen. It was unguarded, brilliant, and full of a relief so deep it shook her whole body. She laughed, a wet, happy sound mixed with her tears. He didn't hug her. The boundary between them, though softened, was still there. But he smiled, a wide, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I never had a doubt," he said, and he meant it. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of practicalities. The program's stipend meant she could reduce her hours with him significantly. They worked out a new arrangement. She would stay in the staff room, keeping the penthouse in order a few days a week, which gave her stability. The rest of her time belonged to music. The night before her first official day with the program, she cooked a simple dinner for them, both a meal from her home country. It was a thank you, wordless but deeply felt. After they ate, she went to the piano. She didn't play a famous, difficult piece. She played the gentle nocturne she had played for the professor. But now it was different. The sorrow was still there, woven into the melody, but over it was a new thread, a thread of hope, of gratitude, of a future reopening. Leo listened, watching her. He thought of the arrogant man who had joked about a piano needing tuning, who had seen a person as part of the scenery. That man felt like a stranger now. When she finished, she turned to him. "Thank you," she said, the words heavy with meaning, "for hearing me. Not just the music, but me." He nodded. "Thank you," he replied, "for the reminder that the most valuable things aren't always on a spreadsheet." The next morning, she left for her new life, a bag of sheet music slung over her shoulder. The penthouse was quiet again, but the silence was no longer empty. It was a peaceful silence, the kind that comes after something good and right has happened. Leo walked over to the piano and touched the keys she had brought to life. He knew the sound was still there, waiting in the wood and the wires, a testament to a talent that had almost been lost and a humanity that had been found. Their story as employer and employee was changing, but a more interesting one as two people who had unexpectedly changed each other's tune was just beginning.